The rain had been falling since sunset, thick and cold, the kind that soaked through clothes and hope alike. And Clara Bennett stood beneath the flickering neon sign of yet another roadside hotel with her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift as if sensing her fear. Every hotel had been the same, polite smiles turning tight the moment they noticed her condition, eyes dropping to her stomach, whispers exchanged behind the desk, excuses about being fully booked even when the parking lots were half empty. She didn't argue anymore. She didn't beg. Each refusal carved something deeper out of her chest, reminding her that once her fiancé disappeared and left her with nothing but a ring she couldn't bring herself to sell. The world had decided she was a problem it didn't want. By the time she reached the edge of town, her suitcase felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of everything she'd lost. That was when she saw the old pickup truck pulled over near the diner that had long since closed, its headlights cutting through the rain like a quiet promise. The man leaning against it looked carved from the land itself, broad shoulders, weathered jacket, cowboy hat pulled low, but his eyes were gentle when they met hers. He noticed the way she winced as thunder cracked, the way she steadied herself before taking another step. "You look like someone who's been told no too many times tonight," he said, voice calm, steady, the opposite of the storm around them. Clara tried to brush him off, pride flaring even in exhaustion, but when another wave of pain rolled through her back, she stumbled, and he was there instantly, catching her without hesitation. She expected questions, suspicion, maybe judgment, but instead he simply said, "I'm Jake Mercer. I've got a ranch a few miles out. It's warm, dry, and safe." She shook her head, tears mixing with rain, saying she didn't want charity, didn't want trouble, didn't want pity. Jake looked at her belly, then back at her face, and said the words that cracked her open completely. "Ma'am, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering shelter. And you don't look like trouble. You look like someone worth protecting." As they drove into the darkness toward the ranch, Clara watched the town lights disappear in the rearview mirror, unaware that the night everyone else closed their doors would become the beginning of a life she never imagined she deserved. The ranch house glowed like a beacon when they arrived, golden light spilling through the windows and cutting straight through the chill Clara had been carrying for months. And the moment Jake opened the door, warmth wrapped around her in a way no blanket ever could. He didn't crowd her, didn't pry. He showed her where the guest room was, laid out fresh towels, and quietly left a bowl of stew, warming on the stove as if he'd done this 100 times before. Clara ate slowly, overwhelmed not just by the food, but by the feeling of being seen as human again, not a burden or a mistake. Over the next days, the ranch revealed itself as more than land and fences. It was a place where silence wasn't judgment, where the morning smelled like coffee and hay, and where Jake spoke to her baby as if it already belonged. He never asked about the father, never demanded explanations, yet somehow made her feel safe enough to tell him everything. Anyway, the rushed engagement, the promises made and broken, the night she realized she'd been abandoned and invisible. Jake listened without interrupting, fists clenched not in anger at her, but at a world that had failed her so completely. As weeks passed, Clara began to help around the ranch in small ways, laughter returning softly, cautiously, and with it came feelings she was terrified to name. When complications in her pregnancy forced a late-night emergency, Jake drove through the storm like his life depended on it, refusing to leave her side at the hospital. And when the nurse assumed he was the father, he didn't correct her. He simply squeezed Clara's hand and said, "I'm here." In that moment, she understood that love wasn't always loud declarations or perfect timing. It was staying when walking away would be easier. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and strong, Jake stood at the window of the nursery with tears he didn't bother hiding, realizing the ranch had never felt like home until now. Clara looked at him, heart full and steady for the first time in her life, and knew the future didn't scare her anymore. Because the cowboy who opened his door when the world shut her out had given her something far greater than shelter. He had given her belonging months. After the baby's arrival, the ranch settled into a new rhythm that felt older than time and yet brand new to Clara. Mornings beginning with soft cries from the crib and ending with sunsets that painted the fields gold. And in between, there were small moments that quietly stitched a family together. Jake rocking the baby at dawn so Clara could sleep, Clara learning the land by name and feel, the way the wind changed before rain, the way Jake's silence always meant he was listening. The town took notice slowly, curious glances turning into nods of respect when they saw how carefully Jake carried the child, how gently he spoke to Clara, never once acting like a savior, always like a partner. When a letter finally arrived from the man who had vanished, Clara's hands trembled as she held it, old fear threatening to undo everything she'd rebuilt. But Jake didn't tell her what to do. He sat beside her on the porch, steady as the posts holding the roof, and said, "Whatever you choose, you won't face it alone." She didn't open the letter. She burned it in the fire pit that night, watching the past turn to ash, realizing closure didn't come from answers. It came from safety. Spring brought a small-town gathering, and when whispers followed them, Jake stood taller, introducing Clara not as a guest or a favor, but simply as my family, and the words settled into her bones like truth. One evening, as the baby slept and the stars stretched endlessly above the ranch, Jake spoke with a quiet certainty that stopped her breath, telling her he didn't rescue her that night in the rain. He found her. And being found had changed him too. Clara understood then that love wasn't about perfect beginnings. It was about choosing to stay again and again, even when the world once refused you a room. She rested her head on his shoulder, the land humming softly around them, knowing the promise they shared. Didn't need vows or crowds, only tomorrow. The first winter, after the baby learned to walk, came. Harder than anyone expected, snow piling against the fences and silence stretching long across the ranch. Yet inside the house there was laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging Clara once believed was meant for other people. She watched Jake teach the child to take steady steps across the wooden floor, his big hands hovering close, ready to catch a fall. And something inside her settled completely. This was what safety looked like. The town no longer whispered when they passed. Instead, doors opened, names were spoken kindly, and Clara realized how deeply Jake's quiet integrity had shaped the way others saw them. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire cracked low, Jake finally spoke the words he'd carried patiently for months, telling her he didn't want to be the man who once offered her shelter. He wanted to be the man who stood beside her for the rest of their lives. There was no grand speech, no ring pulled from a velvet box, just truth spoken plain and steady. And Clara answered without fear, knowing love didn't need perfect timing, only courage. In spring, the ranch bloomed wild and bright, and they gathered a few friends beneath the open sky, the baby in Clara's arms as Jake promised to choose them every day, no matter how hard the road became. Clara looked around at the land, the people, the life built from one rainy night and a single open door, and understood that being refused by the world had led her exactly where she belonged. As the sun dipped behind the hills and Jake squeezed her hand, she smiled, not because the past no longer hurt, but because it no longer owned her. They hadn't just found a place to stay, they had built a home, one choice, one kindness, one tomorrow at a time.